Erica, and thanks everybody for answering those questions. That last one especially is good to see. For those of you who in tandem answered that you haven't used Azure yet and you're looking to use it soon, hopefully this webinar will be right up your alley. Really, it is going to be an intro to Azure, but it's going to cover the landscape or kind of the foundation of Azure, where even if you've been using Azure, because I saw some of you in the poll have been using Azure at least a little bit so far, it can fill in some of the gaps of things maybe you missed as you jumped in. So especially us as developers, maybe we just jump in and grab a SQL, Azure SQL DB and start developing with it. Well, you're kind of missing some of the foundational pieces of Azure, some of the security pieces, just not kind of knowing what all's going on there. And so hopefully this webinar will help you fill in some of those gaps or help you get started. So first, I'm Brad Gall. I'm a principal consultant here with Pragmatic Works. You can see my contact information there. Feel free to reach out if you guys have questions after the webinar or interested in talking about any of these topics any further. I've been working with the Microsoft Data Platform for about 15 years now. I like to speak at user groups and webinars whenever I get a chance. I chase Rugrats on a daily basis. I have two children there that keep me and my wife pretty busy. We reside here in Jacksonville, Florida, where Pragmatic Works headquarters is. And in the little bit of spare time I do have, I'm an NFL aficionado, particularly for my Green Bay Packers. So our agenda today, we're going to basically go through 3 parts in our talk today. We're going to do an intro to Microsoft Cloud, do an intro to Microsoft Azure, and I'll explain the slight differences there, and then we're going to do a quick example using Azure IaaS. We're going to be pretty slide heavy today. Usually I like to do a lot more demos, but just because of the subject matter, it made a little more sense to do this demo-wise. So as we jump in here, first of all, raise your hand if you guys remember this commercial. This is back from, I had to look up the air date on this. This was back in 2012. CDW actually was putting these commercials out for cloud data centers and migrating your data center to the cloud. We've come a long way since Charles Barkley was telling us how we should be migrating our servers. In that time, Microsoft Azure has matured a lot. So the thing I wanted to point out here is if you're starting to look into cloud, but maybe you've looked at it a couple years ago, it's changed quite a lot, just even in 24 months, even in 12 months. A lot of things have changed. Office 365 has become much more robust. SkyDrive has become pretty much a staple in a lot of organizations. People are moving their phone systems to Skype in the clouds. Lots of movement here to the cloud, to Microsoft Azure services as a whole. If we take a step back and just talk about really what the services are out there in cloud, it breaks down into 3 flavors. And this may be something that you have seen before or heard of before, but the way we in IT like to break these things down would be something called IaaS, which would be infrastructure as a service, something called PaaS, so be platform as a service, or finally SaaS, software as a service. The differences between these, really it's just a categorization of the different services that Microsoft offers out there. Would be with IaaS, it's really what you have control over and what you have to manage with the service offerings that fall within these different categories. So with IaaS, if you guys are looking to do a lift and shift of maybe some of your resources, those of you that on the poll question that said that you were looking to do server hosting in the cloud, that's going to be an IaaS offering where you're going to get a virtual machine in the Azure cloud that you spin up, and you're in control of the OS, the network, the software that gets installed, and any development that you do on there. You're going to be in control of all of that, and you're going to have to manage all of that as well. Now with platform as a service offerings, there's going to be things like SQL DB. We'll talk about what these different offerings are, but with PaaS offering, basically Microsoft's going to handle a lot of the OS, the configuration of the platform for you, and you're just going to have to configure the platform. So in the Azure SQL database scenario, you're going to configure the SQL server itself, the SQL database and the indexes and things like that, and the development on that, but you're not going to have to take care of patching the SQL server, for instance, or patching the operating system, or dealing with firmware drivers or anything like that. And then finally, we have what's called software as a service. And with software as a service, pretty much you're just using the service to do your development or do your productivity. Now, if we look at where the different services fall within these different categorizations, on IaaS, again, it's going to be VMs, so you can be running either Windows VMs, you can run Linux VMs in Azure. A lot of people don't know that. We can run some Docker's images if you guys are starting to look into Docker. With Platform as a Service, this is going to be your Azure SQL DB or your Azure SQL DW, Azure Data Lake, HD Insights, Event Hubs, all of those services where Microsoft is basically giving you the platform to develop on, but you're not having to control or configure any machines underneath that. And then finally, our software as a service platforms within Azure really actually don't fall quite underneath the Azure umbrella, depending on the marketing material you look at. But this is going to be Office 365 or Dynamics CRM or Power BI, those offerings from Microsoft. Now, with all those different categorizations, there's a lot of decisions to make about maybe which choice is correct for you and for your workload. So with the choices, it's great. We have the ability to pick whatever's right for our project. So if I have a lot of expertise and my application requires a lot of tweaking of something within the OS, IaaS is probably going to be a better bet for me. Or if I have a lot of security requirements around it, things like that, and I'm okay with managing and configuring those servers, then IaaS might be a better fit for me. So for instance, if I'm looking at some IaaS servers or I'm looking at using Azure Web Services, I could go with IaaS servers there. Same thing with SQL Server versus Azure SQL DW or DB. You could run either of those two different scenarios in Azure. We could install SQL Server on a Azure VM, or we could just go with the platform as a service for Azure. There'll be some reasons specific for your project for why you would go with either. And if you're looking at a big data implementation, we could do something like run Impala on IaaS boxes, or we could go with HD Insight or Azure Data Lake. And again, it all depends on your project and the skill sets that you have on your team, and just basically which product would fit best for the project that you're implementing. These are all things that we help customers with a lot. We do data architectural design sessions with customers to understand really where all these different pieces feel. Really the point to make here is that you need to have a good understanding of what you're looking to accomplish with your project, and then which of the different services would fit, because there's a lot of different choices we have. Just as an example of that, I think most of us are probably familiar with SQL Server, especially if you're coming to Pragmatic Works webinars. We're just going to use that as an example of what the different configurations give you in the terms of SQL Server. So to start off with, the most basic scenario would be a physical server on-prem running on raw iron. You're going to have the highest dedicated cost for that, right? So one thing to think about with if you're coming from that scenario and looking to go to the cloud, that's your highest cost scenario and your highest administration scenario. Now there are customers we work with all the time that that scenario fits. For instance, if you have a workload that requires 20 terabytes of memory and you're looking at putting in 24, 48 cores into a box to run your workload, that's probably going to fit best on a raw iron machine still. But where we've gone since then is if you're not needing that just raw power, to cut down on cost and cut down on administration, for years now we've been going into virtualization, and we started to virtualize our SQL servers where we can have less hosts and more virtual Windows environments to run our SQL servers. From there, there's a natural leap into the cloud offering where we can go to infrastructure as a service. So this is where I want to start talking, where we can run a SQL server in Azure VM. This would run on virtual machines similar to if we were running this in our private cloud, if you want to call it, or on our VMware or Hyper-V installation on-prem, except for now that we don't have to manage that host anymore. We're not going to have to add more hosts to our cluster if we start running out of space, or add more memory to our hosts if we start running out of memory, hitting specific memory pressure or CPU pressure. So that would be a common scenario we work with customers a lot on. How do you lift and shift up to Azure and move those VMs up there so you can cut down on those administration costs? Now, another option though would be to run SQL Server as a platform as a service. So we not only have the option to run SQL Server on a VM within Azure, we can run SQL Server as a platform. It's called Azure SQL Database. And as I mentioned a little bit ago with Azure SQL Database, basically we spin up a SQL database as a resource. So Azure gives us a database. We can develop within that database, create tables, create indexes, create users, connect to it from our web apps, connect to it from Power BI, things like that. We can do all of that within the database, but we don't have to administer the SQL Server anymore. The only part the SQL Server really plays for us with Azure SQL DB is just to hold our logins and kind of act as a container for us to manage our databases. But we don't have to worry about the rest of it. So a lot of scenarios that can be a great fit if you're trying to get a web app out to market quickly and you don't want to have to spend the time to install and configure a SQL Server. You can spin up a Azure SQL database in a matter of minutes. So it's something to keep in mind as you're looking at which platform is right for the project that you're looking at. Well, that's not good. All right, let's hope this comes back well. All right, sorry about that. Let me jump back in here. All right, so that was the overview of the Microsoft Cloud offerings. And what we're going to jump into in our next topic here is specifically Azure for the cloud offering for Microsoft. So Azure really only entails IaaS and PaaS configurations. So Office 365, Power BI, they're actually going to be handled in a different portal than Azure. So if you're going to manage Azure, you're looking to sign up for subscriptions for Azure, there's two URLs that we're going to use. Those are going to be account.azure.com and portal.azure.com. And one of the things I just wanted to point out that throws a lot of our customers off as they're just kind of starting to dip their toe into the cloud space with Microsoft is that the software as a service offerings are actually managed through separate portals through the tenants of office.com and from powerbi.com. Same for Dynamics CRM. So something to keep in mind as you're looking to set things up and sign up for subscriptions, things like that. The other thing I wanted to point out before we jumped over to Azure is that Microsoft Azure Active Directory is actually shared across these different offerings. So specifically, I want to point out the software as a service of the Office 365 and anything you do within Azure is going to be tied to the same Azure Active Directory. So if I create a user within my Office 365 tenant, that same user is going to be available within Active Directory within Azure. And this is just a screenshot to show you kind of topology of how that would look. We can sync our Azure Active Directory from our on-prem to Azure Active Directory, and then we can then use that to authenticate and do a security within all of our cloud offerings, including Office 365 and Azure. So let's look into Azure specifically now. So what is Azure? Just real briefly, it's a public cloud offering from Microsoft. And one of the key things to point out here is that it's regionally available. So different resources, which we're going to talk about here in a moment, are available within different regions. This is just a high-level map of the different regions that Azure is available in. And really the key thing to keep in mind here is that you want to use a region that is as close to you or your users as possible, just to keep down on the internet latency that could come between your users and the resources that you're setting up. Now, Azure Resources. So about a year or two ago, Azure went through a major overhaul of how it's managed. So we're going to talk about the way it's managed now. Just keep in mind that there was an older offering, not an offering, but an older setup of Azure that you'll see in the documentation For today, we're going to talk about the new one, which is called Azure Resource Manager. You'll see ARM, Azure ARM, ARM templates, which we'll talk about real briefly here in a minute. But this is the layout of how the new portal is laid out. So within Azure, you're going to sign up for subscriptions. You can have multiple subscriptions per user, per corporation, and that's really recommended. So if you're going to have a test environment set up for developers, then you're going to have a finance maybe department that's going to do some of their own Azure stuff, and then you're going to have like your enterprise corporate IT subscription. All of those can be set up in different subscriptions. First of all, so this could be the top layer of your security, and also for billing purposes, those can be invoiced separately. Things like that can be managed through subscriptions. So the key point to keep in mind there is that you can have multiple subscriptions for your company. Now within subscriptions, there is something called resource groups. Resource groups, every resource that you create is going to ask you what resource group you should put it in. Really, these are just a really handy utility to group different objects together within Azure for management and again for billing. So on your billing statements and on your billing monitoring, you can do things like filter by resource groups and see where your costs are coming from. So if you set up resource groups in such a way that you're organized with them, it can be really helpful for understanding what's using the most resources, what's costing you the most within your Azure subscriptions. And then also for management, you can do things like delete an entire resource group, which would delete, for instance, if you set up a test Azure web app and a database behind it, you could delete both of those really quickly together. Now the resources are going to fall within the resource groups, and those are going to be things like VMs, the VNet that goes to a VM, Azure SQL DB, event hubs, the storage accounts that we need to set up, so many things. Every little piece is a resource, and those are all going to be tied to a resource group. And the last thing to point out, another thing that we can take advantage of to help us organize what we have set up in Azure are tags. We can always tag any of these resources, which is just another way to organize it and do a search across the different objects we have in Azure. Now, Azure Security, the poll question that asked what the biggest holdback was to implementation of cloud, that was an interesting one. I would say about 12 months ago, security would have been much higher on that list for a lot of people. This has become less and less of a concern because Microsoft has given us a lot of different ways to maintain and make sure that our environments are secure. It's still a concern for a lot of people, so that's why I put the slides here. But the big thing to keep in mind is that we are able to secure our data in our environments within Azure. You own all of your data there, and you're in control of who gets access to it. So some of the mechanisms we can use to maintain that will be Azure AD, as I mentioned a little bit ago. So Azure AD is what we use to control access and authentication of our users to the resources within Azure. The new ARM setup of Azure Resource Management gives us the capability now to do resource-based access control. And what this means is that we have granular control now over the resources within Azure and who's able to get to them through Azure administration via PowerShell or through the Azure portal. We can now control that down to the resource. So if we want to give a specific group of users access to, say, just the Azure SQL DBs or just to the Azure Web Services, but nothing else within that subscription, we can now do that with RBAC. And then each individual resource we have may or may not have some security that we want to set up around that as well. So with our Azure VMs, we're going to put them into VNets. VNets within Azure are secured within themselves, so you cannot, VNets don't cross-talk across each other for networking unless we set up specific configurations that allow that to happen. So everything that's within a VNet can only talk to the other computers within that VNet, the other servers within that VNet. For things like Azure Storage, we have shared access signatures which secure the storage accounts that we create. And then there's usually, or pretty much anything you would want encryption on has encryption on it. So we have encryption at rest, we have encryption in flight for all the different resources within Azure. Now specifically around Azure Active Directory, Just want to point out a few things about that. So it does have integration with on-prem Active Directory domains. So Active Directory, Azure Active Directory is primarily user accounts and authentication of users. We can sync those users we have in our AD domains to Azure Active Directory. We can either do that just via an offering from Azure called Azure AD Sync, or we can set up a federation between our Azure domain and Azure Active Directory if we'd like to. One key point to notice here too is that each subscription, so if we create 3 subscriptions within Azure, each of those is going to be associated with one Azure Active Directory. Those should say AAD, not ADD. But each subscription is associated to one Azure Active Directory, meaning that that directory is what we can use to do the RBAC security on. And the last key point for there too is that Office 365 is also tied to one Azure Active Directory. So that's where the usage of creating users in either side, you'll be able to see or utilize those users or groups across the 2 different platforms. So as an example of how you can secure a resource within Azure, we'll use Azure Storage as an example. So an Azure Storage account is where we can store blob storage. We can store virtual machine hard drives. We can store just a dumping of files up there. We could store lots of things, whatever you need to store. This is the basic mechanism of storage within Azure. So to secure that, we can use our role-based access control. We can then delegate access to storage objects within an account, and that's going to use the SAS URI, the shared access signatures. The encryption in transit is going to be available, so HTTPS protocols will be implemented. The data is encrypted at rest. And Azure disk encryption, if you're using Azure Storage, which you have to for VMs to store the virtual disks, those virtual disks can be encrypted as well. And then there is another resource out there in Azure called Azure Key Vault, and we can store our encryption keys into the Key Vault so that we can secure them and maintain them in a secure way. Last bit here on security, if there are concerns around any type of compliance things that you need, for instance, HIPAA or SOX compliance, anything like that, there's a trust center that Microsoft maintains and that you can go and review. And in that trust center, for instance, they have a compliance section. I'm just going to click on this for one moment, and you can see they have a listing of all the different compliance offerings they have available. So if you click on any of these, they give you a lot more information. Let's do HIPAA. If there's any healthcare partners on the phone call, so they give you some information about HIPAA, actually telling you what you need to do to maintain HIPAA compliance, and then they show you where which services are covered by HIPAA. So under Azure there's another cloud for Azure Government. If you guys are in the government space, there's a separate cloud for that, and it shows you what is covered for HIPAA compliance there as well. So really good resource to go look that up and get the specifics on how well you're covered for those compliances. Now, Azure Management. So let's talk about Azure Management a little bit. We talked about the different resources and the buckets they fall within. To manage those resources, we have a lot of different options. One is going to be portal.azure.com. So this is just going to a website. It's all GUI based, and we can create objects, delete objects, stop objects. Whatever we need to do, we can do via GUI interface, and the way we access that is portal.azure.com. But we also have a lot of other automated ways to handle management of these Azure resources. We can use PowerShell to connect and create these objects. We can use Azure CLI to connect those, so it's just a command line interface for Azure. Some resources can be controlled and managed through Visual Studio. So for instance, you can create a Visual Studio project that will actually create resources and tear them down if you need to, or scale maybe your web services if you need to. The other scenario would be just controlling and developing on your Azure SQL database. You could do that through Visual Studio and do deployments through that. And then finally, with the newer version of Azure, we have ARM templates. ARM templates are great. Really, the main foundational change that happened when we went to the ARM scenario with Azure is that they went from an XML code base over to JSON documents. And what they did when they made that shift was give us the ability to use ARM templates to create and deploy the resources we have within our subscriptions, which makes it a repeatable process to deploy something or tear it down. And the nice thing about the ARM templates is that they can run in parallel. So if you have a ARM template that you go and push out to Azure and it creates 6 VMs, those can be created in parallel, which cuts down on the time it takes to create those. You can do the same thing in PowerShell. So we could do create VM, et cetera, in PowerShell. We get a little bit more of a robust interface with ARM templates, and that they run in parallel, which is a great feature. All right, the last piece here on the intro to Azure section is the cost and billing. So a lot of clients we talk to, obviously they're crunching the numbers, trying to figure out how much is this going to cost, what kind of budget do I need to do for this, how does it compare maybe to what I'm already doing on-prem, et cetera. So a few resources out there to handle this. One would be the pricing calculator. So I'm going to click on this link as well. If you go to the pricing calculator for Azure, this is another great resource. Basically, they give you every resource that's available out there, and let's just pick a compute and a virtual machine. And what it does when you click on them is it asks you a few questions about what you're going to do with it. If we're going to do manage disks, and then it gives you a cost estimate for what that would cost to run that resource. So we can add as many resources as we need to here, and then we get a total cost estimate of what it's going to cost per month to run that resource. So you can add everything from data lake to VMs to SQL DB, do a comparison between DB and DW, for instance. All that type of stuff. We can use this nice tool to figure out the cost differences there. Now, a few things I just want to point out for managing the cost and the billing here. One of the things to keep in mind with Azure, if you haven't gone there yet and you haven't really thought about scalability and elasticity, something to keep in mind is that you don't have to leave all these resources on 100% of the time, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. If it's a resource that just loads up some data and then doesn't do much, we can either shut it down or scale it down, do things like that. The other scenarios, we could scale up our server as it's needed. So instead of throwing 24 cores at a server right out the gate, if we think we're going to grow to that in the next year, but we're not there now, we could start with 12 cores, and grow from there dynamically. So definitely something to keep in mind to take advantage of that, and keep that in mind as you're doing your pricing and your calculations of how much Azure is going to cost for you. And then finally, with cost and billing, we want to monitor our usage, right? We want to know how much we're spending and what's being spent on what. Within the Azure portal, and I'll jump over there and show that here in a moment, you can see how much a resource is costing, so you can see some billing GUIs there. Within the Azure the Azure Account Center, we also have some pages there that will give you your invoices, and you can also download to CSV, so you can do some of your own analytics maybe to see which resource groups were costing the most. And then there's also a few other custom or third-party products that we could utilize to give us a little bit more robust reporting if we're having a lot of resources to maintain. So one of those would be the Azure Usage and Billing Portal, and then there's some third-party products. And then to be quite honest, there's a fourth option I left off of here, and that would be to use a cloud solution provider. So another thing we talk to a lot of customers with is just managing the overall setup and billing and all of this for Azure. It's one of the things we do with a lot of customers is handle that for you. So you can do that. We're a CSP, cloud solution provider, which allows us to be able to do that for customers, which is another very nice offering that you can take advantage of. So let's hop over to Azure Demo now and just show you quickly what some of these things look like. So the first, and I pulled this up because the website was running a little slow earlier. The first two URLs that I mentioned before were account.azure.com and portal.azure.com. So two different URLs that are key to keep in mind as you're setting up and again, starting to set up Azure. portal.azure.com is where we go to create subscriptions. So this is a subscription I have on my account right now. I'm just using a Visual Studio Dev Essentials subscription. This is a good time to point out that you can get a trial subscription to just test out Azure if you'd like. If you have MSDN accounts for your developers, they can also use their MSDN account to set up a development subscription against their MSDN account. Or we can set up, this is the same portal we'd come to for our corporate portal for setting up our pay-as-you-go accounts or our EA accounts. So a lot of you that have EA accounts, you actually have some Azure spend included with that. So it's another thing to keep in mind to go find out from your Microsoft rep, maybe how much Azure spend you have available on your EA agreements, and make sure you're taking advantage of that and testing it out and using those credits that you get. But all the subscriptions would show up here. I just have one right now. This is this Visual Studio Dev Essentials subscription. I'm gonna click on that and see if it opens quickly or not for me. But really when I click into that, you can see things like who the administrator on that subscription is. This is where we can get to the invoicing and billing. So yes, we can see here the overview. I can do billing history. This would take me to those invoices I have. You can see, for me, I have a spending limit because this is a free trial. So I could remove that limit if I wanted to or needed to. It tells me when my credits are going to expire, things like that. Now, if you go to portal.azure.com, you're going to get a much different interface within this URL. So this is the URL you're going to use to manage and actually use those subscriptions within Azure. So this is the dashboard. I'm not going to spend too much time here. A lot of the other Azure webinars out there go through this a little bit further. But very quickly, we have a dashboard here in the middle, which we can move set up these tiles however we'd like to, show whatever we'd like to on the dashboard here. This is a listing of all the different resources I have available. One of the things I wanted to point out is I can also see my subscriptions here within the Azure portal. So if I click on subscriptions here, I just have the one subscription right now, but if I had 3 or 4, they would all show up here and I can see the current cost, things like that as well. Now I mentioned if we go down our tree of containers here, we have subscriptions and then we have resource groups. So I have a few resource groups set up within my Azure. So I have a server demo, a quick test, just a few things, because again, this is just a little Visual Studio Essentials subscription. If I click on any of those resource groups, you can see I get an overview of that resource group and I get all of the resources that are contained within that group. So it's a nice way to navigate your portal and find out what is associated to the different resource groups. And we're going to talk about, in the next little set of slides, all the different pieces for IaaS, just use as an example. So while we're here, I just want to point out all the different pieces that are necessary to set up in a VM. And what I did when I set them up is I put them all within the same resource group. So you can see the power of that, how that comes in handy now. As I clicked on that resource group, I can see all the different resources here. So this would be my virtual machine. You can see the type there, the disk that's associated to it, the NIC card that's associated to it, storage account, a public IP address is its own resource within Azure, and then virtual networks there and security groups. So all of that would be there. And if I click on, for instance, my server, it will take me to the overview of that particular resource, in this case, the server, and I can see things like the CPU usage that's going on with it, disk ops, things like that. And then I have a lot of configuration and settings there as well. The last thing I wanted to show you in the Azure portal is if you click on all resources over here on the left, this can be handy once you start getting into those hundreds of resources and you're trying to figure out where that one piece was that you couldn't remember where it's at. This lets you search and find things there. So if I type in demo, it's going to filter it down to just the demo objects, and I can filter this down to, again, just a resource group. And if I had access to multiple subscriptions, you would actually see another drop down here for subscription as well. So you can find out what resources in which subscription, things along those lines. So let's hop back over to our slide deck. And we're going to wrap up here with some slides on the IaaS setup. So for Azure IaaS. So the anatomy of an Azure VM, I just wanted to touch again a high level, keeping an intro here, of what you need to set up an Azure VM, because this is an area that we see a lot of our clients trying out first, thinking about as a easy way to migrate to the cloud and replace some dated servers is just to do lift and shift with the servers as they are and lift them up into Azure. So Azure VM, Azure IaaS is how you would do that. So to set up an Azure VM, what we need is a network. We need to set up our network and configure that. We're going to need to set up and configure storage, and we're going to need to set up and configure compute. Now, network, I think, is the one that's, for developers specifically, is one of the areas that we don't spend the most time in. So I think it's a key point to point out for what you need and how Azure uses networking. So we're going to have a VNet to our corporate network so that we can connect and migrate objects up to Azure. So one of the things that your infrastructure team is going to need to set up is on your routers or whatever they're using for VNet connectivity and security configs for that. They're going to need to set up a VNet up to Azure. There's something called an express route, which creates a very fast tunnel from Azure directly to your corporate network. Something to keep in mind there if you need that type of speed. Now within Azure, though, we're going to have Azure VNet. So within each of the virtual machines is going to have to live within an Azure VNet. That is that blue dotted line around the picture you're seeing there on the left. So all of these machines, all these resources fall within this one VNet, which means that they're able to talk to each other and communicate to each other. We can also set up subnets within the VNet. So we can segment our VNet into subnets if we so choose. In this example, we have two subnets, one for the front-end web servers and then one for the back-end subnet. One of the reasons you might want to do that is all the security and configuration on the virtual networks within Azure is handled via something called network security groups, or NSGs. You'll see it. An NSG can be applied to a subnet or a resource NIC card. So we can set up things like inbound, outbound rules, and we can do that at the subnet level or at the NIC level. Something to keep in mind as you're designing how you would like your Azure virtual networks to be set up. Now, storage for Azure, we're going to have virtual disks associated to our Azure VMs, and those are going to be saved within blob storage. One thing to look at when you're creating VMs is that you can take advantage of managed storage for VMs. And what managed storage does, it takes away a little bit of the administration of the storage account that we would have to handle if these didn't exist. And it basically handles that piece for you and creates the Azure behind the scenes, the VMDK file. Creates that for you and puts it into a storage account for you. Something to look at if you're looking at storage primarily for virtual machines. And then with storage, there's something to keep in mind as well is that you want to keep in mind not just your storage space that you need to leverage, but also what kind of throughput do you need from those disks. So similar to when you're designing a SAN, if you're doing that on-prem, we're going to need to do the same thing with our Azure storage, and thankfully Azure gives us an option for premium storage for high throughput workloads. Basically, those are solid state drives that we can use. The last piece is compute. So compute is the scale. How much CPU and how much memory do we need to create to that virtual machine? This is scalable, so we can scale these up and down as the workload grows, down to the hour even is how it'll be built. So as we scale it up and down, so at night we maybe scale it down because we don't have as many users on it, and we bring it back online with more resources in the morning. We're able to leverage stuff like that. We want to take advantage of availability groups for production workloads. So when you're looking at production, do some research on availability groups and what those mean. You need to utilize those to maintain the Microsoft SLAs. Basically, you would need two machines for instance, for a web server, put into two different availability groups. So that's if for whatever reason, for maintenance or anything like that, that server has to go down and get migrated over to a new virtual host, you don't take down your application. And then finally, again, just want to point out that your compute resources can be stopped. So I can stop my virtual machine. I will not be charged for that virtual machine while it's stopped. One thing to point out here, though, that can be a gotcha for people as they're new to Azure is that there's a big difference between shutting down a virtual machine and actually stopping and deallocating it within Azure. So if it's stopped and deallocated, something we do within Azure, you're not being charged for it. If you just shut down the virtual machine from within Windows, it's still allocated in the Azure cloud, and so you're still going to be charged for it, even though that is not consuming really any CPU cycles. It still has procs associated to it, so that's why you're still being charged for it. So that's what I had for today. I know it was a lot of material, filled a good portion of the hour there. So I have a little bit of time to take some questions here. Yeah, thanks everybody for your time. If you have questions, Eric, or were there any questions I could answer?
Yeah, let me go through here. I have one from Chandresh. He says, I am an ASP.NET developer new to Azure. Do I have to install Visual Studio on a VM on Azure, or is there an option like a checkbox to set up a VM with this installed?
So I'm not sure if there's a dev box that has that all installed on it already, because I usually, you can still use your laptop or your on-prem server. So you just need to make sure you download the Azure SDKs and the Azure projects for Visual Studio, and you can connect to Azure and deploy from your home network or your corporate network.
Okay, next question's from Alan. How do you stop a VM and restart it?
A couple of different ways. If you're in the portal, when we were on that overview of the VM, there's a stop button right at the top. So that's the easiest GUI way to do it. You can also do it from PowerShell. So there's a PowerShell commandlet that will stop the virtual machine, that compute resource for you.
Okay, is there an express route between Azure and IBM Cloud? How does let me see. How does cloud to cloud interaction work?
So there is connectivity between them. I'm not sure about Azure to IBM, the specifics around that. But we can do things like Azure Data Factory is able to connect to, so Azure Data Factory is a platform within Azure that moves data around, and we can connect to AWS or I believe IBM, I haven't used that one as much myself, and pull data in and out of Azure between those two different clouds.
Okay, Trent asks, what is the best way to get large amounts of data to the cloud on a daily basis?
So on a daily basis, if you're pumping a lot of data up there, you're just going to have to probably look into that express route option. Really, you're just going to want to get the highest bandwidth you can for the VNet connection to Azure. It's really going to be your best option there. You can do things like, so it really depends on the type of workload. So just as an example here is if you're pumping up some blob data up there, you want to take advantage of things like zipping up the data first before you pump it up there. So it cuts down on the bandwidth. And if you're looking at a large scale initial migration up to the cloud, if you start getting to that 2 terabyte range of data that you want to pump up there, to initialize your data, you can do things, I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but if you look into storage on docs.microsoft.com for Azure, basically what you can do is ship a hard disk to Azure, and they'll connect it to a blob storage account for you, so you can physically ship the data to them if you need to.
All right. Next question. Let's see. When are you going to? Let's see. You mentioned a lot on tours of the portal. Can you suggest where I find one? Will Pragmatic Works On Demand soon have a class on Azure?
So I can't speak to the on-demand platform. We have a lot of different subject areas that I know are on the roadmap that they're looking to add. So definitely send that feedback in if you're looking for specific things like Azure. Email your sales rep and get that feedback into us, and that helps us know which ones to put out there first. But I can't speak to that specifically. On the portal itself, really, I'd say probably the best way to tour it is, so I did a intro to Azure SQL DB. I did a little bit more of a tour of the portal there in that webinar, and that's available just on our free webinars there. A really good way to do it though is just to to get access to a subscription and start poking around in it. It's really pretty user-friendly and easy to use. So the quickest way I suggest learning it for the portal piece of this, at least, is just to get into the portal and look at it.
Okay. Is there any document or use case to understand the resource computation that is required for any platform?
So like a translation of the course. So if you're talking, I'll speak specifically to IaaS. They give you the specs of the CPU and the memory there. So if you're looking to translate a workload from on-prem up to the cloud, you can see what type of CPU and memory are there in the cloud and size your VM accordingly there. One of the nice things though about the cloud is that you can test the workload there and then delete or shut down the VM when you're done. So one of the things we recommend is to, you can do a lot more testing as opposed to having to do a bunch of arithmetic to figure out what's needed there. The preferred method would to be get it there, test it, see how your workloads are running there, do POCs, things like that.
Okay. Next question: Are SSIS services and SSAS multidimensional available in Azure?
So yes and no. So if you're talking as a platform as a service, not quite yet, but you can always run them as a VM. So that's what we do with customers right now is we install SQL as IaaS, so install SQL on a virtual machine, and then we can run we can run IIS, and we can run multi-dimensional models there on that VM.
Okay. How much of a concern is latency when moving a VM from on-prem to the cloud?
I'm sorry, I missed that one, Erica. Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah. How much of a concern is latency when moving a VM from on-prem to the cloud?
So as long as you keep your region close to your users, we haven't run into too many problems with the latency of the VM there. One thing to keep in mind though too is the workload. So I'm probably going to be wary of putting something like my web app in the cloud and having that talk to my database on-prem. You just want to make sure you have that network configured very well for that if that's the topology that you're going to go with. So to cut down on that, what we try and do is keep if we're moving a web app up there, we would want to move the database with it as well, which keeps the latency really low between those. And then the latency between the web app and our users is, we definitely haven't seen problems with that.
Okay. Is there a free trial account available, or do you have to pay to test out Azure no matter what?
Nope, definitely lots of ways to get free trials. So what you saw, my account was completely free. All I did was sign up for a visualstudio.com account. So those are free and they give you $25 a month for, I think they change it around. They do different offers, but they always have a freebie for about $25 a month for 4 months or 6 months, something like that. The other option too is when you go to Azure, you can just sign up for a free trial. I believe the way it is right now, it might have just changed, but it used to be that you would get $200 of Azure credit for a month to test it out. And again, that's free. They do require a credit card to be associated to the account, but as you saw in my portal, there was a spending limit associated to that subscription. So by default, it will not charge your credit card unless you turn off the spending limit. So the limit is set to whatever your credit is, the credit on the account is. So if you have $200 credit, once you hit that limit, it shuts everything down and you won't be charged anything. So definitely options to test this for free.
Got it. What are the first workloads most customers are moving to Azure?
So that's a really good question. Couple different scenarios. I'd say our biggest one right now is IaaS workloads, and it's really just lifting and shifting of database and web app workloads up to Azure. As data centers are starting to age and you're looking into upgrading hardware, instead of upgrading the hardware and upgrading the data centers, they're just lifting and shifting the servers up to the cloud. And the reason for that is timing. So there's a lot less configuration involved with that. You get your data and your workload into the cloud. And then from there, you can start looking to leverage the different platforms as a service, stuff like that. I'd say right behind that, though, would be new development or new data analytics initiatives. So setting up Azure Data Warehouse, doing Azure ML, big data initiatives. Those are another big one for us because of the scalability of the cloud. So those are great workloads to use in the cloud because typically you don't feel like buying 8 servers to be able to scale up your big data and analytics just for them to sit there for a while before you get everything up and running. We can do a POC up there, test it out, scale it out as wide as we need it to run through our data set, and then shrink it back down when we're done doing whatever analysis we're looking to do.
Okay. Is there an easy way to migrate from AWS to Azure?
There is, I wouldn't say an easy way. There's no wizards or any products that are just going to migrate and shift over your RDS database over into an Azure SQL database. We do help a lot of customers with that, though. So really, it just comes down to proper project management, planning, making sure you have all you've done an assessment of what you need to migrate, what you have first of all, and then what you need to migrate, and then just planning accordingly and migrating the data there. We leverage tools like I said earlier, Azure Data Factory to pull the data, so it goes cloud to cloud to pull the data from AWS over to Azure. Just doing things like that is the biggest thing to keep in mind with that type of migration.
Okay, have about a minute left here before noon, so let's get one more question. Can you use partitioning or file groups to split between premium storage and standard, or an entire database set up on a storage type?
Yes, so if you're talking about a SQL virtual machine, you can associate multiple virtual hard drives to it. You have to go to a certain level of scale to be able to take advantage of the premium, but then you could have a couple of premium disk sets attached to it, and then a few standard regular hard disk drive virtual disks attached to it, and then just like any other SQL server, you could do file groups split across those different virtual disks. Another thing to keep in mind, just to add maybe a little extra to that one, is as we wrap up here, it would be one of the cool things about the cloud is we get some new scenarios where we have blob storage now with Azure SQL DB. So if we start looking to migrate from the VMs over to the platforms as a service, we can do things like keep our hot data within the Azure SQL database and then put our cold data into blob storage and then take advantage of Polybase within Azure SQL DB to be able to query the blob storage still. So we can still query it, see the data, but it's been offloaded onto blob storage to where it's not costing us nearly as much money. So some really cool scenarios that we can take advantage of in Azure that we didn't have before.
All right, well, I will go ahead and wrap this up. I know we didn't get to all of the questions today, but I will be able to send that over to you, Brad, in case you want to reach out to anyone and answer their questions. I want to thank everyone for joining our webinar today. As always, we do record all of our sessions, and you will be receiving if you registered for this webinar, you'll be receiving a follow-up email that includes a link to that recording tomorrow. You can also find the recording on our website at pragmaticworks.com. I usually get it up a little bit after lunchtime. So thanks again for your time, and we look forward to seeing you all next Tuesday for another free training session.